Hello and welcome to Spotlight Matthew for today as we continue our verse by verse and passage by passage investigation of the first gospel. Well, today we come to one of those hinge portions within our study. That means that we have just wrapped up a previous section of Matthew's presentation. We've been looking in chapter 13 at the parables of the kingdom, and having finished chapter 13, we now are going to be looking at another large chunk within Matthew's presentation. Again, always remembering Matthew is indeed a historian. He wants to give us the accurate biographical information about Jesus. At one and the same time, Matthew is also a theologian who wants to present Jesus to us, both in Jesus' person, who he is, as well as his works, why he came and what he intended to accomplish. Now, as you have become perhaps familiar with at this point, we use these hinge opportunities to do some retrospect, to review where we have come so far, and then also to do prospect as we consider what will be coming up next in our devotions. So let's begin with the retrospect. We are about to start chapter 14. What have we seen already in chapters 1 through 13? Well, be reminded that the Gospel of Matthew breaks into three basic components. The first component is the presentation of preparation for Jesus' coming, his active ministry. We find that in chapters 1 through 4. And then in chapters 5 through 20, we see the presentation. Having been prepared in 1 through 4, we turn to the presentation of Jesus' public ministry in Galilee of the Gentiles. And in a certain way, this presentation is also a further preparation for chapters 21 through 28, which is all about the Passion of Jesus, his final week of life as he comes into Jerusalem during the Passover of AD 30 or AD 33. It records the events of that week leading up to Good Friday and culminating in Resurrection Sunday. So that lies before us. So we find ourselves now, as we are on the cusp of chapter 14, in this first section of presenting Jesus' ministry, his public ministry for 3 years. And what territory have we covered in chapters 5 through 13? Well, first of all, we saw Matthew gave an example of Jesus' mighty words, his proclamation in the Goat Sermon, the greatest sermon of all times, that is the Sermon on the Mount. And then, wonderfully, Matthew follows right on the heels of this mighty words presentation with a mighty works presentation. In chapters 8 and 9 through verse 34, we saw 10 mighty works of Jesus where he healed diseases, he cast out demons, he raised a dead little girl, and he showed his mastery over the wind and the waves. The next section began in chapter 9, verse 35, and went to the end of chapter 10, and we called it Jesus' Mini Missions Manual. Jesus showed the motivation for why we should share the gospel of the kingdom. He selected his 12 apostles or disciples who would follow him in presenting the kingdom of heaven. And then he jumped into his teaching, giving them actually instructions about what they were to do as he sent them out on their first short-term missions trip, and it would become something of an instruction manual for Christian missionaries and witnesses as we continue to forward the gospel of the kingdom in our time. Having looked at that in chapters 11 and 12, we then considered mounting opposition, conflict between Jesus and the really religious folks. We saw how they wanted to destroy him, and yet on the other hand, Jesus was very good at dishing it back out, calling them a brood of vipers and people who are evil. And in the midst of that mounting opposition, we came to the end of chapter 12, and then finally turned to the segment we have just considered, which is Jesus' third block of great teaching, and that was the parables of the kingdom. And we saw that sometimes the parables conceal things from people who do not have ears to hear, or eyes that want to see, and hearts that are hardened. And yet at one and the same time, these parables marvelously can reveal more about the kingdom, about God's reign and rule over his people, north, south, and east and west, in all times and all places. So we concluded finally by seeing these two groups going opposite directions, the disciples having things revealed to them so that they understand the kingdom better and better, and yet then Jesus goes to his hometown of Nazareth, and they reject him. They take offense at Jesus for his mighty works and mighty words, and he does not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So there is a thumbnail in just a few minutes of the territory that we have covered to date. So what's coming up next? Well, it is a big block of material that covers the rest of Jesus' public ministry, from chapter 14 at the beginning to the end of chapter 20. We will have many themes that come into view, but I want to recommend to us that the one theme that kind of holds them all together has to do with the training of the 12. That is, the training of the disciples. Jesus is preparing them, I think, more intensely and intentionally from chapter 14 through chapter 20 than he has heretofore, because we see that Jesus is preparing them for what will come in chapters 21 to 28, the Passion narrative. And not every passage has something to do about training the 12, but a lot of them do. So what I want us to do is consider, with our eyes looking very intently at where the disciples appear in these coming chapters, the 12 of them being addressed or instructed by Jesus as he makes them into new men who will be fishers of men and women and children. But not only are we to look for the disciples as the 12, look then for a smaller group of disciples, an inner ring of three, Peter, James, and John, and the instruction and the experience he particularly gives to that group of his disciples. And then very specially in 14 through 20, Peter rises to be the one disciple who will be the leader and the center point of the 12 disciples as we come down to the story of the Passion, and then beyond the Passion to the resurrection and the birth of the new church. We'll run into lots of incidents that that address the subject of the training of the 12. And as we do, as always, the point here for us is to realize that Matthew does not only want to show us how Jesus trained those 12, Matthew was part of a Christian community. And that Christian community, somewhere between 60 and 70 AD, in the 60s or 70s when Matthew wrote, it was training its people to be ongoing fishers of men and women and children. It was training them to follow Jesus. It was training them to live the kingdom and proclaim the kingdom. And therefore, what I want to recommend is that the lessons that were being taught to the 12 within Jesus' 3-year ministry are the same kinds of discipleship lessons that Matthew wanted his community of believers, his church, to receive and understand. And then catapulting forward, they are the same kinds of lessons that are intended for God's church today. They are Jesus' teaching for you as you seek to be a disciple and follower of Jesus. They're his training and instruction for me. So what we find here is not just the training of the 12, but the training of the early church, the training of the church throughout the ages, the training of our church, your training and my training as we seek to be followers of Jesus Christ. So your assignment for this Hinge Passage Day is a big one. I encourage you to read Matthew chapter 14 through Matthew chapter 20, looking for the big theme of the training of the 12, the training of the church, and our training as followers of Jesus Christ. So that's our Spotlight Matthew for today. Check us out on SpotlightGoodNews.com, like us on Facebook, share us with people so that they can study this great gospel in depth as we continue to make our way with this Lectio Continua, this verse by verse, passage by passage, working through the first gospel. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.